Good afternoon. Welcome to Vanderbilt Law School on this beautiful fall day for this feature event. My name is J.B. Rule. I'm on the faculty here, and with Mike Vandenbergh, I co-direct the Energy, Environment, and Land Use program. I have a few acknowledgments and thank yous to start the gathering. First, this event is co-sponsored with the Vanderbilt Law School ELU program and the Environmental Law and Policy Annual Review, LPAR, which have been generously supported by the Sally Schallenberger Brown ELU Fund. Thank you, Martin. And it is, thank you. And it is co-sponsored by the Private Climate Governance Lab, the PCG, which has received generous seed funding from Dean Chris Guthrie. The co-sponsors from across the Vanderbilt campus are the Vanderbilt Center for Sustainability, Energy, and Climate, VSEC, and Dialogue Vanderbilt. And as always, Ethan Thorpe and Maggie Milam have provided excellent staff support to pull this event together. This event is also the second installment of the Private Sector and the Planet Speaker Series, which is co-sponsored by Iowa Law School's Hubbell Environmental Law Initiative, which in turn is supported by the TIPI Social Impact Community. We welcome those from around the country who have joined us virtually here today. I'm going to introduce Dr. Sarah Igoe. She is the Andrew Jackson Chair in American History. Dr. Igoe's most recent book, The Known Citizen, The History of Privacy in Modern America, traces U.S. debates over privacy from instantaneous photography in the late 19th century to today's debates over social media and big data. In addition to her scholarship, Dr. Igoe spearheaded a major curricular reform in the College of Arts and Sciences and directs the Dialogue Collab, a project of 10 campuses across the country to advance civil discourse. She has brought to our campus leading practitioners such as Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Anne Applebaum, noted journalist Jamel Bouie, and founder and president of the country's leading interfaith organization, Ibu Patel. Professor Igoe is here today as the faculty director of Dialogue Vanderbilt, a co-sponsor of this event, and a campus-wide initiative advancing the university's enduring commitment to constructive and civil discourse by putting into practice the two key pillars of Vanderbilt's approach to free expression, open forums, and civil discourse. Dr. Igoe will introduce Governor Bredesen and Michael Vandenbergh. Thank you, Sarah.
Just a little bit. Hi, everybody. So glad to be here today and at this wonderful event. I want to say a word about Dialogue Vanderbilt, which is really pleased to co-sponsor this kind of conversation happening before us today. Now in its third year, Dialogue Vanderbilt, as J.B. Rule just mentioned, is an all-campus program to promote and model open inquiry and good dialogue habits across every level of the institution. We, of course, are not perfect in this and have a ways to go in our efforts, and really want to invite all of you in to Dialogue Vanderbilt's programs. Today's program is, in fact, a great example of how issues like the energy transition and climate change can be considered in ways that engage and unite us rather than divide us. So it's my real pleasure today to introduce our discussants, two really distinguished treasures of our campus and our state. The first is Professor Michael Vandenbergh, who is the David Daniels Allen, a distinguished chair in law and co-director of the EELU program and the PCG lab. Before joining Vanderbilt, he served in the public sector as the EPA chief of staff and in the private sector as a partner at Latham & Watkins. Professor Vandenbergh is a pioneer in interdisciplinary legal scholarship and is recognized as the founder of the discipline of private environmental governance. And to that end, one of his accomplishments was winning a 2022 Carnegie Fellowship for his work on climate polarization. Very lucky to have him here. And we also welcome to campus today Governor Phil Bredesen, who many of you know, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. He's the co-founder and founding chairman of Silicon Ranch, one of the largest solar providers in the country. Previously unknown to many of us, he served as the 48th governor of Tennessee from 2003 to 2011, and as the mayor of Nashville from 1991 to 1999. So an incredible and long and wonderful career in public service. He's known especially, I would say, for his pragmatic and bipartisan approach, which allowed him to lead major reforms in our state in healthcare, education, economic development, and environmental protection. Before entering public service, Bredesen built a successful career in the private sector as an entrepreneur in the healthcare industry. His work continues to focus on nonpartisan solutions to complex policy challenges, including those surrounding energy and the environment. Governor Bredesen is also the co-host with former Republican Governor Bill Haslam of a podcast called You Might Be Right. So I encourage you to tune into that too. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our two discussants today and let them take us into an hour-long or so discussion about climate. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So if you haven't followed the activities of Dialogue Vanderbilt, please do. It's remarkable how much work is going on there. And I just want to thank Governor Bredesen. He doesn't know it yet, but he just signed on to a 4-hour sworn deposition here at the law school. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your commitment on that. No, seriously, we're going to try to cover as much as we can. And these issues are moving so quickly right now, and they're so deeply embedded in controversy that I want to dive right in and avoid a whole lot of sort of throat clearing, which we do a lot of in the academic area. I'd like to cover while we talk a little bit about your career. We have undergraduates and law students here. I want to explore a tiny bit of that. I want to spend some time on energy issues and energy policy, which is something you certainly know a great deal about, and then flip over to your work on bipartisanship and polarization and so forth. And I guess as to your career, I'm wondering if it's true, the rumors going around that you got an undergraduate degree in physics at Harvard, but you kind of really would rather have gone to Vanderbilt. Is that true?
That's if you say so. That's
You know you're dealing with a pro when that's. So if you wouldn't mind, give us a little bit of a sense. You moved from a physics degree as an undergraduate into the healthcare industry. Did the degree lead directly to that, or did you learn more on a liberal arts kind of front that helped you make a transition over into the business world early on?
I think one of the, when I went to Harvard as a freshman, I intended to be a professor of physics. I mean, that's what I thought my career was at some university somewhere. And one of the advantages of a place like Harvard or like Vanderbilt is it's a liberal arts school that exposes you to a lot of other aspects of life and the intellectual world that you might not have seen before. It was especially important for me because I grew up in a rural community in a small public school. It was a K through 12 single building school. We graduated 38 people in my graduating class. And I found when I was at Harvard that there were a lot of things beyond physics and mathematics that I really enjoyed. And actually started out after I graduated in the computer field, which was just really beginning to develop then, and that took me into healthcare and its organization and so on. So it was a natural transition, and I do think I've told a lot of young people that a degree in the hard sciences is actually pretty good training for a lot of different kinds of careers. I mean, I think it teaches you a lot about the way to think about things and question things and so on. That's been very helpful.
When I first got to know who you were and to read your bio a bit, I assumed that you were, for a very long period of time, only interested on the business side of things. And then I went back and looked, and I saw that you worked on Eugene McCarthy's 1968 presidential campaign. You ran for state senate unsuccessfully in Massachusetts, is that right?
Probably the worst political campaign's ever been run.
You've learned a lot since then, I assume. So it sounds as though you've always had an interest in public service. Is that true? Or did you move into it laterally? How did that?
Well, I have to say, when I graduated high school, I had zero interest or involvement in public service, public sector. I mean, I was going to be a professor of physics and so on. You couldn't be at Harvard in the 1960s with the Vietnam War beginning to escalate and so on, and not have a lot of politics around you. John Kennedy had been closely associated with Harvard. He was a trustee there and a graduate, obviously. And I came to see politics and the kind of thing that Kennedy was doing as an honorable thing to do and useful. And perhaps if I'd come of age politically at a different time, I might not have felt the same way. But I always thought it was something that I'd like to do someday. And then you get on with life. I mean, you get married and you have children and start a career and so on. And I really got involved in it. I started a company and built it up and eventually sold it, and had to decide between reprising the same thing over and over again in my life or trying something new, and decided this was the time, if you're going to do it, to try the political thing. So I tried and lost, and then tried and lost, and then tried and finally won again, and started the career off.
And that's something else that comes through if you look at your bio in a little more detail, that you see these remarkable successes: 2-term mayor of Nashville, 2-term governor, and then you see that you didn't just fall into it easily. You ran some races and lost some along the way. And I think a lot of our students these days kind of assume if you don't win on the first try, then maybe you move on to something else. What was it that gave you that kind of persistence or resilience to kind of keep
Well, you are probably talking to one of the most stubborn people you will ever meet. And it's just like, for me, losing a race like that is like, well, okay, I'm going to fix this, and so on. And so you learn what you can from the losses, and some of them are your own fault, and some are, the breaks of the game. But I'm glad I did, and. I certainly think, whether it's in politics or anything else, that kind of persistence to, take some failures and just kind of keep pushing on and not be discouraged from is an important characteristic, and one I've certainly tried to imbue in my own son and his family and grandchildren now and so on.
Well, in addition to persistence, the Tennessean characterized you, if we pivot a little bit, to political alignment as a political moderate. It says you've known for the middle-of-the-road, fiscally conservative politics, but it also says that you've occasionally irritated liberals. And then a group called On the Issues described you as a, quote, moderate, populist, conservative. And I don't know what that means. I think we'd have to convene a group of political scientists and argue about that for a while. I think, how would you characterize yourself?
Well, I think moderate is probably a good word. I mean, your views on any issues, for me, are, excuse me, I apologize. One of the things that I don't believe about politics is that if you're a Democrat, you have to have this catechism of democratic beliefs, and everything you say and think must be along the lines of that, or vice versa if you're a Republican. So for me, I was treated, politics is not a religion that you have to. Buy all the axioms and so on. It's a kind of club you belong to, and it's one of the ways we structure our political structure. So I think pragmatic is probably the word, which is trying to approach it from the standpoint of solving problems and taking advantage of opportunities, as distinct from performative things, doing things to get you in the press and do those kinds of things. I was very aware that you come into one of these offices, you have a very limited time there, and just always wanted to, spend that time not screwing around with, trying to get on TV, but trying to figure out what are some things that need fixing or fixing here and so on. And I think you can see that in both my career as mayor and as governor. For mayor, it was downtown needed fixing. I spent a lot of time and energy doing that. When I was governor, a lot of it started out with TennCare, which was a huge problem in the state back then. And so probably from the physics background, love solving problems, have found that the solutions to them, the right solution usually is some combination of some liberal and conservative views about things, and try to figure out how you incorporate both of those things and bring people along.
It sounds like you follow along a quotation I found recently in research for a book from Walter Lippmann, the journalist, from 1921. He said, democracy is not about getting everyone to think the same way. It's about getting people who think differently to act the same way. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think these issues that, seemingly divide, Democrats and Republicans or liberals and conservatives today, they're not ever going to be solved. I mean, you're not going to convince people on one side of the aisle that the other side is right. I think a part of the genius of the invention of this country and the Constitution is the recognition that people are not going to agree and they're going to fundamentally disagree on a lot of things. But it provides a path for working through those differences to have a successful society that's able to deal with the issues that it faces and make opportunities for people within it. So I look at it from the standpoint of nobody has has corralled all the truth in the world, and that certainly the official catechism of either party is not the answer to all the world's problems, and trying to find reasonable people who are willing to work together to make things happen. The thing that I really hate about politics today, it's not so much the polarization, it's how many people, and it's really both sides of the aisle, for whom it's a performative thing. It's just all about performance and getting on TV and especially getting clicks on social media and getting clicks on the internet and so on. And one of the things I look for in anybody that I'm interested in voting for or supporting is just like, is this somebody who actually wants to solve some problems in the world, and do they have some tools to bring to that?
Speaking of solving problems, let's talk about the energy transition, if that works for you. And sometimes climate polls as the number one most polarized issue in the country. Energy transition probably a little bit less, but seems quite polarized now too, with the formation of Silicon Ranch and Clearloop. And by the way, both Silicon Ranch and Clearloop have been big Vanderbilt supporters, and we very much appreciate the kind of efforts they've done collaboratively with Vanderbilt. But you started out doing that right after you came out of the governor's office, and around that time, when I was teaching environmental law classes and writing papers, I was talking about what we called the China problem back then, which is not just that China was having rapidly increasing carbon emissions at the time, but that it was the cause for people in the United States to be able to say, well, we shouldn't do anything. And you said on one of your earlier, You Might Be Right podcasts, that we need to show leadership. You did that, I think, in 2022 or so. It almost feels now as though things might have flipped a little bit, and that China is beginning to put on solar power at a remarkable rate. Do you see that flip occurring, or am I misunderstanding what's going on between the United States and China when it comes to adoption of renewable power right now?
Yeah, I mean, China is certainly doing that, and I don't claim any special knowledge of it. I don't particularly think China's doing it because they're trying to be environmentally responsible.
Right.
I think it's got much more to do with geopolitics and their own industrial base, which has a substantial component of the stuff that it takes for solar and wind. But it's it's something that's clearly going on, and even in the time since Silicon Ranch was started. And I might point out that both the chairman and the president of Silicon Ranch are sitting over here. If you have any problems with Silicon Ranch, talk to them, not me.
I see people getting out their cell phones right now.
Yeah. And so on. But I think it really was at the genesis of that, it really was the energy transition itself that seemed to present the opportunities. I've always considered myself an environmentalist in a kind of rural American sense. I mean, for me, environmentalism was not climate change. It was or species preservation. It was planting trees and planting hedgerows and making wildlife habitat and keeping watersheds clean and that kind of stuff. And if you look at my record as both mayor and governor, I mean, one of the things we did, I think, kind of quietly was a lot of stuff to grow things like the park system and especially as governor, put large tracts of land into public ownership to preserve from future development. But as time went on, I think the energy transition has proceeded ahead. I think what's going on now is a blip. I mean, I don't see it as fundamentally changing things. The corporations we talk to, and for Silicon Ranch, I mean, the big ones are the big data center companies, places like Meta and Amazon and Microsoft and the like, and they're all committed to this, irrespective of what the government is doing about tax incentives this year or something like that. So I think there's still a lot of momentum behind this transition to some more renewable forms of energy in the mix.
Well, let's pick up with the data center issue a bit, if we may, because we're hearing an enormous amount about that, and it's become a reason why the U.S. is backing off of environmental standards in some cases. There's projections of 10–20% of increases in electricity demand. A question I have for solar is, how does solar compete in that environment in terms of price, in terms of how quickly it can be installed? Does it require solar and battery to provide firm power or some other kind of regular power? Where is solar in the fight over who's going to supply this build out in the data center?
Yeah, I mean, they're all interested in renewable energy for reasons of the public perception of their companies and a desire, I think, increasingly to do things that the kind of young employees that these companies want to hold and keep are attracted to. I think of solar as it's a piece of the puzzle. In very rough terms, most electrical grid systems can take about 30% plus or minus of non-dispatchable power. Like solar that works in them. California is kind of there now. Germany is kind of there now. As a country, we're nowhere close to that. So I see it as one of the tools that you can use to try to put together a much lower impact generation of electricity. And I think it's particularly important because electrical generation is a quarter of the CO2 output of the United States, and it's the one that doesn't require new research or big economic incentives. It's already the kind of the cheapest form of new generation out there, so you're not waiting for some technological breakthrough to make better concrete out of something that doesn't require so much energy. Or not. It's all there. The demand for electricity is clearly going to increase. I think it's a combination of both these data centers. And also, if electric vehicles take off the way I think they're expected to over a period of time, they'll have their ups and downs, that adds a lot to it. So, a system in this country, a part of the economy, which is the production of power, which has been pretty stagnant for a couple, 3 decades in terms of it, I think is suddenly going to start seeing a very sharp increases in demand. You certainly are seeing that with the data centers. And solar, I think needs to be a part of the equation of sorting that out.
And you mentioned subsidies and so forth, and one of the arguments you hear about solar for pushback is that it can't survive without current ongoing subsidies. Is that the case? Is that an incorrect assumption when it comes to the question about how you compete heads up? Is that an old argument?
I think it's completely incorrect. I mean, solar is today as cheap as it gets for new generation, and it's been utilized by companies through a long period of sort of declines in the price of putting in solar. So in a way, if you lose some of those subsidies, all you really are doing is turning the clock back a year or two on the pricing, on the pricing scheme for it. And people were perfectly happy to will it at those prices. Now look, I like the subsidies. It makes it easier and so on. But to be honest, if they were all to go away tomorrow, the big, Meta is still going to keep building data centers with solar power, and it keeps on growing. So one of the issues I think with the federal government and the Congress in particular is that in the Congress, it's a little bit like, the old saw about if the only tool you have is a hammer, you make every problem into a nail. The tool that the Congress has is appropriating money or appropriating tax things, and they don't seem to want to pick up any of the other tools that they have out there. And so they tend to think of, if we want to promote solar, it's got to be about subsidies, okay? Whereas it really doesn't. There are things they could do in terms of permitting reform, for example, that would have a dramatically greater effect on the distribution, the push on solar. than the subsidies are having. And I hope at some point somebody will come along who understands that. It's, if at Silicon Ranch, as of last year, and I haven't checked again this year, but if we got a contract for a new solar thing, it'll take about 4 years before it actually comes online. 3 of them are permitting, 1 of them is construction. You can clearly see where the critical path is there and where maybe some attention could be paid. And a lot of the permitting issues are things like you have permitting structures at the federal level with things like the interconnection standards that are built around a power system in which the way you generated power was you built big fossil fuel plants or nuclear plants that took 10 years to bring online. They were a huge concentrated source of power, and you have a distribution system that's built around that kind of a time scale, an approval process, and that kind of a structure. And solar is very different. It's much quicker to construct. It's much more distributed with pieces around there. And just in some ways changing the permitting process and staffing it correctly and so on so you could get these things resolved would be a huge step forward. So, I think it's something that the Congress is, and frankly, the president has kind of missed out on as the way to really push this forward.
One of our colleagues who introduced the program today, J.B. Rule, is block quoted in Ezra Klein's book on abundance about the Green's dilemma, as he and Jim Salzman have called it, this challenge about how do you get full public input into permitting but not let it be something that stops the energy transition in a way. Right. So it's certainly something we're working on here.
If there's anybody in here who has not read that book, by the way, I highly recommend it to you. I think it's a very perceptive look at kind of the way the pendulum has swung so far in the direction of protection, that we don't make these kinds of mistakes, that you're really getting in the way. One of the examples he gives is about how few actual charging stations have actually been built as a result of all the money that's in there. And we've seen the same thing. The Congress passes something, there's a lot of money there, they want something to happen, and you're just constantly running up against these walls within the government of, people saying, no, we've always done this kind of permitting this way, we've always done ruled construction in this way, and we're just not going to change.
So one of the ways that we're seeing some barriers out there, it seems, is that rural communities get convinced that siting solar power or siting wind is a liberal thing. And I wonder whether this is a transition toward our concerns about the bipartisanship, that we hear about communities essentially thinking about power in a way that runs through group identity as opposed to just looking at what the benefits might be.
I think if you try to justify things in terms of global warming, that's true. But in general, I think that's probably not true. I mean, when we build at Silicon Ranch, when we build the very large kinds of arrays, the utility scale arrays, you by nature are going into typically poorer farming communities. I mean, that's where the land is affordable to do this kind of thing. And in those communities, if there's blowback, and there is, it tends to be more about you're taking farmland out of production, that's un-American, as opposed to this is a liberal kind of idea. I mean, we have states like Georgia where the governor will come over to a solar farm opening who probably does not believe in global warming at all, but really believes in rural development and sees this as something which is can help to revitalize the economics of some of these much poorer rural counties. I mean, you build a big solar array in a county, I mean, it instantly becomes the biggest taxpayer in that county, and people from all parts of the political spectrum respect that.
Well, that's good to hear. We just finished some research that suggests that when a conservative male hears that EVs are mostly driven by liberals, we couldn't find a financial incentive great enough to get them to say they would buy one. And so we see that kind of barrier sometimes in the work we do. And the same is true for labels, on the light bulbs. When they get eco-labeled, you see a spike up in left buying and down in right buying, which is really troubling when you think about how to move forward. Let's shift, if we can, then, to the whole question about polarization and how that is playing out right now. And I would just say that if you all haven't listened to the You Might Be Right podcast, tune into it. I've now listened to the almost 50 episodes you all have, almost every one of them, and it's
you need a hobby.
This is my hobby, but you're right. And I have to give a hat tip to the Baker Center, Baker School at University of Tennessee, and to Governor Bill Haslam, who's done that with you. Remarkably thoughtful. It reads like a political science seminar, and we can't give you credit for it, but it's well worth reading in that light. And as you go through that, you realize that you all are taking polarization and partisanship seriously, and I wonder how much of that is indicated by your own experience. I think about the political science literature, which right after the Second World War basically said the American parties weren't different enough, and that what we need to do is make them more different so we could have more choices by voters. It seems like, well, now we have different.
We did.
And you won 68% of the vote, 95 Tennessee counties, every county, in your second race for governor. You must have won a lot of independents and Republicans in that second race. Then you run several years later and you lose by 10%, which means that you weren't getting many. Is that part of why you're in this game now? Is that an indication of just how serious this polarization problem is?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was a real lesson for me, both about how people vote and what they consider, and just the extent to which this polarization has happened. You're right. I mean, when I ran for re-election, actually I think became the first governor to win all 95 of the counties. And by the time I left, it wasn't terribly different from that. I mean, it was if there had been an opportunity to run for a third term, I don't know if it would have been all 95, but I'm pretty confident I would have won an awful lot of them, and so on. When I ran for senator later, not that much later, I guess it'd be 6 or 7 years later, I won 3 counties. To me, in part, it's a mark of the polarization, because I talked to any number of Republicans who had supported me for governor, who basically said, loved you as governor. If you want to do that again, which I can't, but I mean, happy to be there for you. So I'm not going to send another Democrat to Washington. I'm just not going to do it. And I had people, like Lamar Alexander, talk to me about having had the same experience and talking with their Republican friends. So it's unfortunately, I think it's gotten to the point where people are depending too much on the tribal label, not quite enough on thinking for themselves about who the people are who are doing it and what they actually want to happen. I hope it's a transitory thing. It's a couple, 3 decades of our history, and not longer than that. But we'll see.
And can you talk a little bit about the origin of the "you might be right" phrase that you use in that podcast, and whether or not you think that the kind of discourse you've had across immigration and education, you just had a really interesting one on the role of higher education, its relationship to society. Is that making a difference? Where does the idea of "you might be right" come from, and do you think you're beginning to move the dial at all with that podcast?
It's I think neither of us think the podcast is going to sort of save the republic or anything like that, but the idea was originally Bill Haslam's. He came to me with it. It was one of those things you say, I wish I'd thought of that, but signed on to it. It's being done through the Baker School, and it actually takes its name from something Howard Baker, said once. It was basically just remember, the other fellow might be right, which is basically his way. I mean, he was certainly a partisan person. He believed in a lot of the principles of the Republican Party, and at the time, but also I think understood what I said at the beginning of this thing, which is, our Constitution, our country is designed to function even in the face of people who have very different views about some of those kinds of issues. I think was very good about arguing for his view of how the world ought to work, but being willing to understand that you also need to move ahead and make things happen. And to do that requires some compromise and some adaptation to other people's principles. So it really comes from that statement. And at the end of our podcast, we do this thing where we ask the person we're interviewing, have they ever had that experience? Have they ever had experience of something they believe deeply, and then they talked to somebody who felt very differently and they changed their view on it? and have gotten everything from some really good answers to some really bad answers to that to that question. But that I think that kind of just a little bit of humility, which is what he's really talking about there, that you might not have all the answers, or your particular religion and tribe might not have all the answers to something, is something that I wish were more widespread in people who are elected to office today.
That's something we certainly see in research as well. You can give a group of people a set of policies, and you can, if they're Republicans, you can tell them Republicans support this and they'll support it. You give them the same policy and you say Democrats support it and they'll oppose it, and vice versa. So
right.
we just certainly see that over and over again, as you've experienced.
Well, parties are kind of a shorthand way of, you say Democrat or Republican, and that sort of calls forth all of these views that they particularly have and stand for. It's over the years has been a handy way for people to distinguish in some ways between candidates without having to get down into the weeds of their opinions on every particular issue. It's just kind of gotten out of hand now in terms of the tribalism.
And it seems like that works hand in glove with a growing sense that compromise is a problem. I love the quote. You've probably heard this from Mayor Ed Koch in New York, where he says, if you agree with me on 8 of the 12 points on my platform, vote for me. If you agree on all 12, go see a psychiatrist. We have a good psychiatry department here in our med school, but we don't have a big enough group for everyone to go there who seems to be totally unwilling to be on board unless you agree right down the line. Do you see more of that happening during your career, or is that a part of the problem?
Yeah, I see that, but I also think that that people are that there are ways that people can push back a bit on and cut down a little bit on the polarization in the way that they think about things. And I would say that I think it's true on both sides of the aisle. The notion of having a little bit of humility about your views on the thing. One of the things that Bill and I found in these podcasts, for example, was that if you're careful to not make somebody make all their tribal identities clear right at the outset, you can get more subtle answers to questions. For example, we did one on guns and gun control. We talked about it ahead of time. We had people on both sides of the issue, both thoughtful people, and we said, if we start this out by saying, "Are you in favor of the Second Amendment or not?" You'll meet everybody. They say it. They've declared their stuff, and everybody's off in their own corner. And instead, we started it off with there were 40,000 gun deaths in America last year. I think we can agree that's not a good thing. What are your thoughts about that? What do you think? Is there something we could change? Is there something we have to live with? Whatever. And actually ended up with, I think, quite a thoughtful discussion that I learned a lot from about the issue. The thing I always preach to people is that tribalism. You might think it's not like it's bad or new. It's something. It's wired into us. We're a tribal species, and it's very advantageous to our to our survival as a species to be able to band together in tribes and cooperate and have the ins and the outs and so on. So it's not something you're going to make go away. It's something you just have to work within. And I think there's ways of doing it. So I also want to add, I don't know if you were going to bring this up or not in the conversation, but I think universities have got a huge role to play in helping to make this happen. That they're not. That in many cases they're not really fulfilling today. On the subject of climate change, for example, I think one of the problems is that people who believe in climate change and believe that we need to do things to fix it have approached it in a way that's not sensitive to the lives that a lot of other people are living. And that the way I've described it is you have a whole bunch of people who are young, are college educated, have everything going well in life for them. They have health insurance, they're secure financially, and so on. and they don't care what a gallon of gasoline costs, telling a whole bunch of other people what they need to sacrifice because of climate change, who do care a lot about what a gallon of gasoline costs. And until we can get more sophisticated, I think, about the way we present these views with respect to the fact that there's a lot of different life experiences out there, I think we'll continue to be unsuccessful. And I think, frankly, I think the academic community is one of the sources of that problem. I'll just be honest with you. You know, having people who are academic, you know, in that world, they have so much to offer in terms of, you know, the solutions to problems, you know, thinking through complex kind of, you know, issues and approaches to things, but doing it with a respect for somebody who, you know, lives on a farm in rural Tennessee and just has a very different life experience and point of view about these things, I think is really important.
We have our own tribalism in the academy.
Yeah.
We all do. It's an intuitive thing. And as a physicist, you're probably quite familiar with this quote, but Richard Feynman, the famous Caltech physicist, said, the first principle is not to fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. And it feels like we do that a great deal. One of the things we've been doing with our research here is looking for exactly those kinds of answers. And interestingly enough, often when we study conservatives, we kind of get pushback in the social science community about, well, why would you do that? Why are you worried about that? An example that goes right down the lines of what you've been talking about is we think about what are called superordinate identities. So when you're talking about a group, we can think about ourselves as on the left or the right, or we can think about ourselves as all Americans or all Commodore fans or whatever it might be. And we're finding that sometimes when you frame issues with that overarching identity, that can break through a little bit of what you talked about.
I think it's a little bit like I was saying, the thing of if you're just careful to not force people to sort of display their identities. I mean, you think about tribalism, tribes have always had these signifiers of the tribe. I mean, it might have been the feathers you wore as a Native American or the dress you have in Japan. And you see these pictures of schoolgirls in Japan, they're all dressed exactly the same. They're part of that, you know, part of that tribe. And so I think if you can avoid having people sort of making them display those kinds of things, you get a much more interesting conversation.
The other place we're getting some traction is actually quite relevant to Silicon Ranch, because what we're finding is that often people say that they're opposed to something, and let's say climate change is a good example, but often what's happening is that they're anticipating what the solution would be, and they're actually opposed to the solution. And we call that solution aversion. So if you give a group of liberals the idea that nuclear power is the answer to climate change, they get less worried about climate change. You give a group of conservatives that same information, and they're okay with it. You give them information that says it's going to be a tax or a regulatory solution, they get less worried about climate change. What we have found is that when you tell people across the spectrum that there are private sector responses, Walmart, for example, whether you love them or hate them, has committed to 1 billion tons of carbon emissions reductions with the Environmental Defense Fund looking over their shoulder through its 100,000 suppliers around the world. That's like Germany or Japan going carbon neutral. And what's fascinating is both conservatives and liberals are interested more in climate problem and climate solutions when they think that the answer is that kind of response. And particularly conservatives go from being more skeptical to actually getting more on board. And I wonder if that's a part of why you're seeing a Microsoft or an Amazon or someone stay on board, even in an era in which government is backing off a little bit with carbon issues.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly can't speak for them, but I think, I mean, they have a large energy demand. They're very profitable companies, so they're not worried about whether the green electricity costs a cent or two more, which it does in some cases. It doesn't in some cases, and I think you should not overlook that they all. It's important to all of them to keep happy and employed with them, these kind of young professional people. And a lot of the pressure for doing this stuff is coming internally. I remember when we started Silicon Ranch, I talked to a couple of law firms here in town. One of which I won't mention the names, had some interest in trying to do something, and I asked them about, the reasons. They said, well, it's like they said very clearly, I don't care about it, but that's what young lawyers coming in to become associates are asking about these days. It's less about how soon can I become partner and more about what are you doing about some of the environmental issues that this country faces. So aside from all the external things, I think the desire to keep keep a workforce of the kind that they want has become a significant issue.
I had the same experience in DC after giving a talk about what the private sector was doing in private governance. Leading tech manager came up to me and said, I love what you said. I have to tell you, of all the things you said, the only thing that really matters to us is what our employees want. And we can't recruit and retain the best engineers or physicists or whomever unless we're doing the right thing on these issues. So I've seen that, the same phenomenon. So we're going to have to, we should take some questions in just a moment. But let's pivot for just a second if we can before we do and just think about, given all of this, if you are a law student or an undergraduate student and you're emerging into this deeply partisan world, but you really care about the energy transition, you want to have a successful career and you want to make a difference, what would you tell them moving into this world that we're in now? And I would just say that a lot of what they're hearing from social media and elsewhere is conflict entrepreneurs telling them how bad things are. Things are terrible, things are terrible. So I start each environmental law class now with a reason for optimism, just to keep people motivated. And there's a lot of motivation. We might be the most successful society in 300,000 years on some level. What do you tell people when they're thinking, how do I move into this world that is so deeply divided on the partisan front now?
I guess the first thing I tell somebody is just remember that you are in a bubble too. That you think somebody out there who's a MAGA conservative or something is, or for that matter, is is an outlier on the liberal side. You think that they're in a bubble and only listening in the echo chamber, but the same is true of anything. I mean, it's true of me in the academy. It's true in most kinds of operations, and really working hard to get information from outside of that bubble. One of the things I always admired about FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, was that he had this. He knew that. Being a president, you're in a very strong bubble. I mean, you're surrounded by people whose careers are totally dependent on you, and you're very unlikely to tell them something they don't want to hear for that reason. And he was just famous for picking up the phone and calling somebody 4 layers down over in the agriculture department who'd never even seen the president in their life and asking them questions and getting that. But I would say just finding ways to get information from outside of that bubble that you're naturally in is important. And if you end up as a professor at some university, I mean, I think it's really healthy to go talk to somebody who's in the Rotary Club in Grundy County, Tennessee, and just sort of understanding kind of the way that they look at the world. You might find that it's not as different as you might think it is.
Well, let's see if we can get some questions from the audience. We've got a great crowd here. Let's start with Jim and then Jonathan, Linda, and we'll have some others. But Ethan, the head of our private climate governance lab, is graciously the microphone man as well.
Governor, you mentioned 30% dispatchable or non-dispatchable energy could work from an operational and engineering perspective. Why doesn't TVA see that in its planning priorities? When you look at TVA and where it is with non-dispatchable energy, it seems to be fearful of going beyond even 5% non-dispatchable. What do you see as the challenges there? And do you think that there's hope for TVA to be more ambitious in embracing non-dispatchable energy and other technologies like storage?
First of all, remember when I said the 30%, I mean, that is very much a rule of thumb and depends on the actual environment and so on. But that seems to be kind of a realistic place that works. I certainly can't speak to what goes on within TVA, except to say that, I mean, they're in the business of, they need to provide power to people at reasonable rates. By their nature, they're filled up with people who are from the traditional utility world, and so on, who kind of think of things in those terms, and that may be a piece of it too. TVA has always had an element in its DNA, its original construction, of being an economic developer as well as a provider of power. And I do think at TVA, I think they do see that having renewable power available is is important to economic development in the valley. You can see that in things like these changes they've recently made to allow local power companies, the NESs of the world and the like, to create some of their own, source some of their own electricity through renewable power, as recognizing the fact that companies who relocate to Nashville or Memphis or Chattanooga or whatever, a lot of them want to be able to purchase renewable power. And while TVA actually has quite a bit of it because of its the amount of water-based power that it has, it's still there's no more dams to build, so you got to look to other places to do it, and certainly solar has been one of those. So while I don't think they've jumped on the bandwagon full speed ahead, I think they're proceeding cautiously, and I think we'll make some big changes over time to better accommodate these things.
Jonathan and Linda, and then we'll see if we have some more.
Thank you for this really fascinating presentation of your views, Governor. What I'm interested in here is one of the areas that we're starting to see a very important bipartisan political consensus emerge, and this is a huge change since 10 years ago or so when Mike Vandenbergh did the survey he talked about. Is it used to be that Republicans had far more trust in big business than Democrats do, but recent surveying by Pew and others finds that now there is no difference. Two-thirds of Democrats and two-thirds of Republicans think big business is bad for America, and this is an emerging area of bipartisan populist consensus, which on the one hand has the potential to turn down the tribal fights, but on the other hand, for those of us who do think business has a large role to play, and you're the proprietor or the founder of very important large business, how do you think about this growing bipartisan consensus around the area that big business and big finance cannot be trusted and are in fact bad for our country?
I say first of all that one of the things that I think we have to all acknowledge and recognize, excuse me, is that for both parties, the issues that seemingly define the party today are very malleable, and the one that to me is the biggest sort of indicator of that, and the world is full of it today. But the subject of right to life versus choice, okay? If you went into the 1950s, you would find people with very strong views on each side of that issue, and so on. There are a bunch of Catholics, many of whom were Democrats, for whom that was abortion was anathema, for example, and so on. And so what happened is that you had a lot of people who felt very strongly about it, but half of them were in the Democratic Party and half of them were in the Republican Party. It was something that was different from that tribal identity.
And that's what the political scientists were trying to stop happening, right?
And you can see it all over the place today. Republicans have always been the free traders and Democrats the protectionists. It seems to be exactly the opposite, right now. So I think you have to look at all of these ideological things as being opinions of convenience as to what you think will cause you to get votes in the population you want, rather than sort of deeply held principles. Yeah.
I want to go really quickly because some students should ask questions. But I did want to ask you, you talked about how our democracy is designed to accommodate all these differing opinions, and yet you also referenced channelized communications, our bubbles, the algorithms that are feeding us, as well as performative politicians who aren't super interested in governance, right, and resolving these issues. So I'm curious how optimistic you are still about the design, and also are there any issues that we can agree on? And I'm wondering, you started the Land Trust, the wonderful Land Trust for Tennessee with Jeannie Nelson, and Liz McLaurin is here as well. And is stewardship of the land one of those issues, for example?
Actually, stewardship of the land is very much one of those issues. As Jeannie knows, when we started that together in, what was it, 1999 maybe? And I was astounded. Polarization had not hit in the way that it is today at all in 1999. But the thing about it was that people who had dramatically different views about a lot of social issues and everything like that found common ground in doing that. In fact, I started out as the chairman of the Land Trust, and then when I ran for governor, I resigned doing that because I didn't want in any way put any sort of political flavor at all onto what the Land Trust was doing. And even to this day, if you went out there, its supporters, range across the political spectrum. And I think that is a very good example of something that where there is an opportunity for for some common feelings about and approaches to things. And I think that, I think that as you think about public policy, when you have an issue, trying to figure out how you cast it in that way. You think about things like climate change, which very much became very quickly as I described to you, a bunch of sort of educated people who had no idea what living in Iowa was like, who were telling everybody else what to do. That's my criticism of it. But you can imagine saying, if you had a president perhaps who say it, you can imagine saying, look, there's a fundamental change happening in the energy structure. We can put something together that's got something for everybody in it. I mean, let's also push forward on nuclear plants and how we get them permitted and built in time. I mean, that is a largely not zero, but obviously a very low carbon kind of approach to the thing. I mean, I think you actually could have put something together which had some legs when it came to both sides of the aisle. That's not what we decided to do. We intended to make it more of a test of your morality or something rather than a practical thing. So for those of you who end up doing things in policy positions and the like, I mean, I guess I would say when you have an opportunity to present something, trying to figure out how you can present it in a way that's not just, I'm going to hammer this through, and as long as I've got 50.1% of the votes on it, it's going to get done. But instead say, look, is there, what can I offer conservatives here? What can I offer liberals here? And so on, and see if you can't construct something along those lines. I mean, I had that experience as governor with, first of all, with TennCare, which was a very difficult problem when I first came in. Jim here knows all about it. But we were very careful on that to bring to the solution of that some stuff which was attractive to the liberal wing of my party and some stuff which was attractive to the more conservative members of the legislature. And that was really what it took to get it, to get it done. If it had just been, me saying, here's the catechism of how Democrats need to deal with this kind of thing, I think we never would have got anywhere. And I think the stuff we did later on with higher education, with the state system, where we made some big changes in that system, and Bill continued with some more changes when his turn came, had that same kind of element, which is what are some things that are attractive across the board here, and I think if you just keep that in mind. And if you keep that in mind and spend the energy that it takes to kind of understand where other people are coming from, you can be much more successful about pushing these things forward.
Good. Well, we probably have time for one last question. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Governor. Helen Suki-Reyes with Think Tennessee. I wanted to go back to the data center conversation, or in general, load growth. At Think Tennessee, we think about this load growth as a concerning factor for energy affordability and reliability. As you mentioned, EIA estimates that there was stagnant growth in energy prices for a long time, for around 10 to 20 years. But now we see in the last 12 months that electricity prices have grown faster than inflation. Additionally to that, we think of, let's say, data centers as a way in Tennessee to attract capital investments. Tennessee is one of the 32 states that do not tax data centers, and it is estimated that
They
Tennessee.
do not have what? I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Sorry, Tennessee is one of the 32 states that don't have or have tax exemptions for data centers, and it is estimated that there's been over $100 million. $100 million lost in tax revenue for Tennessee from local and state taxes. On another end, there's other states that are thinking about tariffs to data centers in order to meet the needed growth capacity and transmission investment to meet that low growth. In between, what can we do in Tennessee to continue capturing capital investments from data centers, EVs, advanced manufacturing, but also keeping energy affordable for Tennesseans? And how do public-private partnerships play into that?
Well, first of all, I do think there are things you can do on the economic development side to continue to make the state attractive for the kinds of businesses that you want to have there, and I think it's important for which you're well suited. While the legislature will think of that in terms of tax credits, tax credits and tax exemptions and stuff, I think what we found, excuse me, I'm sorry. I think what we found, and Matt Kisber, who was my economic development commissioner, sitting right here, and certainly can talk with you about it afterwards. But I think what we found was that, yeah, those kinds of things are important, especially in getting through that first culling when you've hired some consultant somewhere, who's going to line these things up. But there's lots of other things that corporations, look at when it comes to relocations. One of them is quality of life for their especially executives, unfortunately, but especially executives, and what you do there, and the other is stability. I think one of the things that Tennessee has enjoyed and really has helped with its recruiting of businesses is a history of whether there's a Democrat or Republican governor, things are steady. The Democrat will honor what the Republican did before, and vice versa. And you find out that kind of predictability and sort of understanding what the environment is, and it's not going to go flipping over here when you elect this person and then flipping over here when you elect this next person, becomes very important to them. And that's not only at the state level, it's also at the local level, because a lot of the things they deal with, you think about a Volkswagen plant in Chattanooga or something, a lot of stuff they deal with has got to do with permitting in the county and those kinds of things, and that history of being realistic about that, I think has served Tennessee very very well. When I first got involved with solar as governor, it actually was not through an environmental lens. As I say, to me, environment meant planting trees and protecting watersheds and stuff like that. It was not so much global warming. But what I really felt was the need to create some economic development in the more rural parts of the state. We had for a generation attracted a lot of businesses from the Rust Belt because we would work cheaper and not join a union. And those were exactly the businesses that would move offshore as soon as times got a little tougher, things got a little bit tighter. A company like, you think about a Volkswagen or a big Amazon headquarters, they can't go into the rural part of the state. They need the infrastructure and they need the workforce of an urban area. But what we saw in solar was something that was a developing field where there was lots of room for companies that employed 100 or 200 people that could go in a lot of places and be very valued members of those communities. So we actually got involved in solar through an economic kind of development lens, and I think there are still a lot of opportunities like that. I mean, one of the causes of this, of this polarization we've talked about, I mean, it is in large part a polarization of urban versus rural kind of values and areas. And part of it is the rural parts of our state have had a tough time at the time, even when Nashville is sort of booming and everything is going great. There's a lot of places where that's in the state where that's not the case, and figuring out strategies, and when you have a change like's going on with renewables, it gives you an opportunity to do that, but figuring out strategies where you can bring some of that wealth to all of the people in the state is, I think, it's an important part of what it takes to be successful.
Well, I said at the outset that we were going to do a 4-hour program, and we're not going to do that. As you see students leaving, it's not because they're angry with your comments. The next classes are starting.
I got you.
So just to wrap up, let me just say that if you watch almost any sports program, now people talk about the X factor. Like, what is that X factor? And I often think, oh, what does that really mean? My sense when I was in government and private practice is that judgment is kind of that X factor. And you mentioned that before. And I think of Governor Bredesen as the kind of person who just exemplifies that kind of judgment. If we could find a way to teach judgment to undergraduates, we would do wonderful things. So we really appreciate your sharing your judgment with us today. We'll stop now after 1 hour rather than 3 more. Thank you.
Thank you.